When we are looking at public opinion, one thing that complicates the matter is that it's very difficult to really pinpoint an individual's belief system based on one or two demographic factors. You have to look at the totality of a person's demographic makeup in order to understand their belief system. For example, if you have a woman who is African American and living in the Western region, those demographic factors would lend you to believe that they are a liberal Democrat. However, if you add in the fact that they are also an evangelical Christian, which brings into the equation more conservative ideology and a tendency towards the Republican Party, that person's political beliefs become confusing. And it's hard for politicians to gauge what their beliefs are, what policies they would support, and it becomes hard for pollsters to accurately depict what an election outcome will be based on these cross pressures in our society. Now, when we look at some of these cross pressures and these things that invoke a split in our beliefs and ideology, we look at class, we look at race, and we look at region. When you look at class, the tendency is to believe that people with more money tend to vote for Republicans and have a conservative ideology, and those with less money, poorer people in our country, tend to be more liberal and to support the Democratic Party. And while there's a general truth to that, it's important to note that we are not a class-based voting society, that other factors are far more important. And you can look at the fact that very wealthy people tend to support the Democratic Party, especially in Hollywood, despite the fact that tax policies from the Democrats would target their income. And you also have a lot of Republican support among working class poor, despite the fact that Republican tax policy is advocating for things like capital gains tax cuts that wouldn't directly impact the working class. So class is not a main factor in our voting behavior. It's an indicator, but it's not a dominant factor. Race also plays a role in the way that people vote. African Americans as a group are overwhelmingly Democratic in their support. When you look at the last several presidential election cycles, African Americans have voted nearly 90% or higher for Democratic candidates. There's a variety of factors that lead to this outcome, and it's a historical trend that has happened over time that has been built since FDR, this strong connection between the Democratic Party and African Americans. In the Hispanic voting community, there is a trend towards the Democratic Party. But this voting bloc, which is becoming larger and larger with each election cycle, is still up for grabs, and that's why the issue of immigration is so paramount to both political parties. When it comes to Asian voting trends, there is not a lot of research and data on this, and the research that's out there doesn't take into account the many cultural differences between subgroups in the Asian community. So it's very hard to paint an accurate picture of Asians in our voting population. One final factor we want to talk about is region. When you look at the South, for example, there was a time when the South was strongly Democrat. From about 1860, in the Reconstruction era, Civil War era, to 1960, the South was a strong Democratic voting bloc. Starting in about 1964, with the signing of the Civil Rights Act by Democratic President Lyndon Johnson and Democratic Congress, you started to see a move away from the Democratic Party and to the Republican Party by Southerners. Keep in mind that the Civil Rights Act was seen as a violation of states' rights and an intrusion upon business by many Southerners, and those are two things that are not taken lightly in the South. Coupled with this trend, you saw that in the South a rise of the Christian coalition and the religious movement in politics, social conservative movement, helped to push the South solidly into the Republican camp. When you look at other regions of the United States, the West Coast tends to strongly support the Democratic Party. The Northeast tends to be a strong supporter of the Democratic Party as well. And the Midwest is kind of torn, and that's where we see a lot of the swing states. There's a strong support for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party all throughout the Midwest, and it's really where the battleground for this country in presidential elections occurs.